In the mid to late 2000s, the most embarrassing thing you could be was a Nickelback fan. If you didn't like them, you made sure to dunk on them at every opportunity. If you did like them, you kept it to yourself. Ever since they rose to fame, they existed in this weird space where they were both one of the most hated and yet best-selling artists of all time. Nickelback is certainly not alone in this space either. There are many other artists over the last few decades who were as loathed as they were successful. Recently, however, there's been a phenomenon where both them and many other artists have gotten a newfound appreciation with a younger audience. In this video, we are going to take a look at why some of this older music was hated for so long and why younger listeners are embracing it decades later. Let's start off with everyone's favorite.
And then for the sides, could I have a quesadilla and another quesadilla?
And what kind of quesadilla is that?
Cheese.
So the first time I had noticed this phenomenon was when I saw younger people online fully embracing the music of Nickelback, Creed, Three Doors Down, Daughtry, etc. And it really got to a point where a lot of this music was relabeled as divorced dad rock. And I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory. The original audience for this music had kids, got divorced, and now those kids are rediscovering the music of their parents' generation. Now, to anyone slightly older, a lot of this is just mainstream rock radio from the 2000s. Take a listen. The two artists that have started to get a lot more favorable attention from younger listeners, though, are Nickelback and Creed. I was born in '96, so I'm like right on the cusp of Millennial and Gen Z, and I remember when these bands were both equally popular and hated. And people really hated these guys. Granted, all of these artists were wildly successful, always on the radio, selling out stadiums, and selling millions of records, but they were also famously hated for years. Nickelback and Creed's reputations in particular were always for being some of the most despised bands of all time, usually showing up on the top of lists for most hated artists. I want to take a look at why these artists were hated for so long and see if there is any justification for that hate. The music of Nickelback, Creed, Seether, Daughtry, Puddle of Mud, etc. have had various labels throughout the years. Divorced Dad Rock is the current one, but not long ago it also had the derogatory label of butt rock, which I read once that label came from the fact that older radio stations would advertise themselves by saying that they play nothing but rock. However, the more official genre that these artists fall under is post-grunge, and I think this is where one part of the hate comes from. These bands were getting popular around 10 years after grunge blew up. Super short history of grunge is that in the 1980s, hair metal was the dominant form of rock on MTV and the radio, and towards the end was seen as jock rock that was mostly about partying. It was also becoming really oversaturated with a ton of Motley Crue clones trying to get their name out there. So when Nirvana blew up in 1991 with Smells Like Teen Spirit, it was a breath of fresh air, and them, along with other grunge bands, were seen as a more authentic alternative to hair metal. Artists like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains were not only great songwriters, but sang about mental health troubles, addiction, and relationship issues that resonated with people who weren't into dudes with big hair singing about how cool they were. Grunge also had some characteristics that some were not as fond of, such as the vocal style that has now been labeled yarling, which was popularized the most by Eddie Vedder of Pearl Jam. Grunge's popularity was very short-lived and lasted from about 1991 to 1994. This was due in large part to the death of Kurt Cobain, but also because of the oversaturation of grunge in mainstream culture, and much like hair metal, had a ton of grunge clones popping up left and right. The post-grunge bands like Nickelback, Creed, and Puddle of Mud grew up on that music and understandably wanted to make music that was inspired by it. The only problem is they made music that just felt like an imitation of grunge and was far more accessible to a mainstream audience, which sounds strange since grunge was also incredibly popular with the mainstream, but I think it really comes down to the influences and the background. Grunge was a fresh sound when it came out and took from a lot of different rock influences. It took from 60s garage rock, 70s folk rock, 80s hardcore, and especially from 80s indie rock. It was also very much a descendant of punk rock, which punk's whole thing is authenticity. Even the name grunge came from the fact that these artists were dirt poor and looked grungy. That's why they wore flannels and other thrifted clothes. This is all to say that the original grunge band took from a lot of different influences and put them together to make an original sound. The post-grunge band sounded like they had one influence, and that was grunge music and 90s era Metallica. This made it sound like more of an imitation of their influences. The yarling that was more of a byproduct in grunge was a staple in post-grunge, almost like when a country singer lays on like a really thick southern accent. These artists' music was seen by many as a way to water down grunge music in order to cash in. I personally think this is a stretch. I think that Nickelback and Creed legitimately just made the music that they wanted to make. But if you grew up during the 90s with grunge and were hit with Nickelback and Creed immediately after, I can see how it could be interpreted as them having less than genuine intentions. Essentially, a lot of the hate around these bands come from where they sat in history. Which leads me to my second point as to why these artists are hated so much. The audience for these bands had a reputation for being pretty trashy. Think like faux hawks and barbed wire tattoos. Think of the kind of guys that would yell at their girlfriend in public. Now, I was pretty young when these guys were at their peak, so I didn't have full interactions with their adult fans, but I did want some firsthand accounts, so I polled some friends and family who were a little bit older in the 2000s to get their take on the average butt rock fan. I asked them for a description of who they knew listened to these artists at the time. And we are going to go through those descriptions now. My aunt said, ugh, probably some douchebag party boy still wearing Jinko jeans and Affliction t-shirt with the wings, most likely 2 sizes too small to show their muscles, and a backwards baseball hat. Drinking shitty domestic beer and playing beer pong. She also provided this image to help paint a picture. My mom simply provided me with some pictures of guys with mullets. My friend said it is usually a guy in his early 20s and a lot of times are abrasive and obnoxious. My mother-in-law contributed with, I'm not sure what ages we're listening to Nickelback / Creed / Seether, but I know I did, and I was in my mid-30s, and other people I knew that listened to them back in 2004 were in their early 30s. But I guess if we're going for younger people, I would say they kind of dressed like Zach Bagans from Ghost Adventures. No hate to Zach Bagans, by the way. This is a Ghost Adventures household. Now, how we just described, these bands' audience sounded pretty harsh, and that's because it was. However, the point of this video is not to dunk on Nickelback, Creed, or their audience, but to understand why they were hated so much. A band's audience is going to have a tremendous impact on how others view their music. This fact is also going to play a major role in why younger audiences are re-embracing this music, but maybe not for the reason you may think. We will get to that in a bit. The third reason I think people hated this music so much is pretty simple, and I think is something that everybody can understand. It was just overplayed. It was always on the radio, it was always blasting out of people's cars, and their videos were always on TV. Overexposure in most cases will hurt an artist and people's view of their music. It just happens if they're popular enough. We're going to take a look at these points for another genre here in a second, but I want to make a point on Nickelback and Creed specifically. There's something that happens pretty frequently, actually, where it becomes a trend to hate on a certain artist, and once that happens, everyone kind of dogpiles on when it's not really that serious. I think the hate that Nickelback and Creed got in the 2000s was more of a trend that kept compounding on itself and got a little out of control. This has happened plenty of times with other artists, but I think those two artists in particular got it pretty bad.
Ricky! Don't lose my number! You don't have to call nobody else!
Much like divorced dad rock, there has been another genre that has gotten a newfound appreciation with younger fans. The genre of yacht rock has been having its moment lately, and at the time of me writing this, the yacht rock anthem, Sailing by Christopher Cross, is trending on TikTok. I move at a snail's pace, so I'm sure by the time you're watching this, we will all have moved on to power electronics. So for those of you not in the know, Yacht Rock is a newer label that, much like Divorced Dad Rock, is used to recategorize an older kind of music. It's a label that's applied almost exclusively to 70s and 80s era soft rock, but is much narrower and categorized based on vibes. Not all soft rock is yacht rock, but all yacht rock is soft rock. In its simplest definition, it is soft rock that old rich people listen to on yachts. The staple artists in yacht rock are artists like Christopher Cross, Michael McDonald, Steely Dan, and the list goes on. Take a listen.
like the wind, ride like the wind.
For the entirety of the 20th century, this music was just labeled as soft rock. It wasn't until the 2000s when the name yacht rock was even uttered. The term was coined in 2005 by a comedy group led by J.D. Reisner for their series on yacht rock, and the label caught on from there. To those of you who weren't around in the 20th century for when this kind of music was popular, myself included, a lot of this music just kind of seems calm and inoffensive. However, to most rock fans of the 70s and 80s, this music was disgustingly cheesy. If you were into hard rock like Led Zeppelin or Aerosmith, or punk rock like Sex Pistols or the Ramones, a lot of this music was just underwhelming. To the point where some of these critics were wishing violence on these artists. Lester Bangs wrote in 1971 of soft rock artist James Taylor, quote, "If I ever get down to Carolina, I'm going to try to figure out a way to off James Taylor." Soft rock was one of those labels that nobody really liked, including the artists themselves. It was kind of seen as a more feminine label to apply to singer-songwriters who weren't standing in front of giant stacks of Marshalls. Billy Joel spoke on this in a 1997 interview with, quote, "I know I'm perceived as a mainstay of soft rock, which to me is like soft. I hate that. 50% of the music on my albums is hard rock." Soft rock didn't have a completely bad rap, since the genre also housed artists like Fleetwood Mac and Carole King, but it was still seen as fairly pretentious and commercial. The genre prided itself on singer-songwriters, was far more sensitive than its hard rock counterpart, and was mostly championed by women. None of these aspects are negative, but to the macho hard rock fan of the 70s and 80s, all of this was sacrilege. Now, soft rock shares the same curse that Nickelback and Creed have, where these artists were both wildly successful and loathed by a large chunk of listeners. I don't think another band really captures this as well as Steely Dan. There are genuinely no casual Steely Dan fans in this world. They're either completely loved or despised by the people who listen to them. I like them, but my absolute favorite hater was the late, great Steve Albini. My absolute favorite tweet from him was, quote, "I will always be the kind of punk that shits on Steely Dan. Christ, the amount of human effort wasted to sound like an SNL band warm-up. There's some video where they talk about every song on an album, and each one begins with the not bald one saying, 'This song is based on my deep love of the blues, just a very bluesy blues, deep blues.' Then lays his jazz dork hands on the fucking electric piano." This gets into my point that we got into with post-grunge, where the audience for this genre left a deep impression on those who were around at the time. You did have the later boomers who had their own impression of this stuff, but those who had to deal with the fans of this music was really Generation X. By the time Gen X had grown up, this kind of music was associated with wealthier boomers who could afford yachts, and this was the kind of music that they played. There's a reason this kind of music is called yacht rock, and typically the kind of people who own yachts are not the kind of people you want to be around. These are typically people who are incredibly rude and usually out of touch with the world. I'm not saying that Generation X hates soft rock, but if you ask them to imagine a Christopher Cross fan, it's not going to be a very positive image. In fact, I'd asked my mom this question, and she had said that she imagines like a stuck-up lawyer or dentist. We also touched on this already, but a lot of this music, again, was just overplayed. Michael McDonald was incredibly popular. Steely Dan was incredibly popular, and so was Christopher Cross. In fact, Christopher Cross won Album of the Year and Song of the Year for his self-titled album and for Sailing at the 1981 Grammys. Essentially, if somebody dislikes something and they're subjected to it over and over, they're going to grow to hate that thing, and that especially goes for yacht rock.
There's so much yucky stuff out there, I want to get it all.
Yuck, yuck, yuck.
So the final question is, why is all of this music that was known for being hated by older generations finding a new audience with younger listeners? I think it all comes down to context. It has now been decades since post-grunge and yacht rock were at the peak of their popularity. And Gen Z is not ignorant to music history, but this music has been mostly removed from the context in which it originally existed. When you remove artists like Nickelback or Christopher Cross from their original context, all that you're really left with is just good songwriting. It's actually kind of a testimony to the fact that this music holds up years and years later. This also removes the whole guilty pleasure of listening to these artists also. Gen Z isn't growing up in an environment where the true form of rock music is Led Zeppelin, and they aren't growing up in the wake of grunge music, which had such a strong impact on Gen X. You also have the fact that newer listeners don't really have to deal with the original audience of these artists either. Not that fans of post-grunge or yacht rock have completely died off, but you're not really dealing with them on a daily basis like you would have when they were at the height of their popularity. Right now, the environment is filled with Morgan Wallen fans, which is its own situation. There's also the fact that younger listeners aren't bombarded with this kind of music on the radio and get to find it naturally and listen to it willfully. Anyone who's worked in the service industry is all too familiar with being subjected to the same song 10 times a day. For anyone from my generation needing some perspective, imagine a future generation rediscovering the music of Ed Sheeran. It's yeah, the music is good, but only the first 100 times. The internet has created this environment where the line between cool and uncool has almost completely disappeared. For a long time, my generation had this practice of doing things ironically or as a joke in order to have this layer of defense to enjoy something that isn't cool. And the punchline is that eventually you start enjoying these things unironically, which is what happens every single time. An area where this happens a lot with is fashion. My generation loves thrifting, so let's say, for instance, I go out and I find a camo shirt, which is usually associated with rednecks, and I buy it to wear it ironically. Then, over time, I enjoy the shirt, so I start wearing it over and over, and that turns into the point where I start wearing it unironically. I am slowly removing the context of what the shirt is originally associated with, and eventually it just becomes a normal, regular piece of clothing. This same thing is happening with music. Yeah, dude, I'm totally just listening to Nickelback as a joke until I realize it's all I'm listening to, and then it's not really a joke anymore, is it? And I think this phenomenon has eroded a little bit over time. I think younger listeners aren't really listening to things ironically anymore and are really just enjoying the things they like from the get-go. This has created a melting pot of both old and new culture on the internet. And this is a good thing. What this has created is an environment where music has been recontextualized and can almost exist in a bubble. It is being re-examined and being judged based on its quality as opposed to its audience or its context. And my generation has its own things with this, right? We have a certain image that comes to mind when we think of a Morgan Wallen fan or a Playboi Carti fan. We also have music that is played way too much on store radios. So we are not exempt from the same thing that has plagued older generations. But we have a lot of distance from much older, hated music and can have a newfound appreciation of it. I'm sure that future generations will do the same thing with Happy by Pharrell or whatever. If you've made it this far, I do want to know, do you think that Nickelback is deserving of this revival that it's having with a newer generation? Do you think this is a trend that will continue with future generations? Also, be sure to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.